All right, good morning. Good morning. How are you? I told Quinest last week he was so good that you guys may actually want him to be the pastor.
Yeah.
I don't know. So, well, if you weren't here last week, we are in the middle of a conversation in which we're discussing hate, and we're talking, as one part of this series, we're talking about racial hate. And the reason that we're doing this is because it's such a big deal in the news. It's everywhere. I mean, it started last summer. Actually, August 9th, it was my anniversary. That was also the day on which Michael Brown was shot, and it just seemed like it just started this huge tidal wave of just racial angst and tension. It kind of brought it to the surface. And I said last week there's an old preacher, and his name was Charles Spurgeon. He always used to say that a preacher should have a newspaper in one hand and a Bible in the other, and should speak to contemporary events, and should say, this is how we should live as Christians today. And so Quinest and I have been friends for about 3 years, and we have one of those friendships that allows us to have these kind of conversations. So we talk about race and race issues a lot. And a couple months ago, I said, Quinest, we need to talk like this in front of our church, because he's given me permission to ask him all kinds of questions. And we started this last week. If you missed it, you can go online, church180.tv, or our Facebook page, facebook.com/mychurch180. You can see the video from last week. I covered a lot of ground last week. It just felt like there was so much, and you guys were texting us questions. We're going to put my number up on the board. You can actually text in questions today if you're interested, and we'll do our best to cover all of them. This is going to be the final installment on this conversation, but our hope is that this is actually a catalyst for more conversation, maybe between yourself and friends who aren't like you. I mean, it could be a black friend, it could be a Latino friend, it could be a gay friend, it could be a lady, it could be a man, whatever the case is. Talking with people who aren't like you actually gives you the opportunity to learn a tremendous amount. So let me just remind us a little bit why we're doing this, and then we'll get into this. Racial retention is a huge reality in our culture, and Jesus said that love is the distinguishing characteristic of his church. Jesus said the one thing that will set Christians apart from the rest of the world is your love. And so hate is this huge reality in our culture, and we say, because we follow Jesus, because we believe in Jesus, we want to be different, and the thing that will make us different is love. And so we believe that the church should be a leading voice in the context of hate. In a world in which there's so much angst and misunderstanding, the church should have a lead voice in this conversation, and that's one of the reasons we're doing this. And our desire here as a church is to be a place where Sunday looks like Monday, plus the love of Jesus. Right? Like Monday looks like you go to the grocery store, you go to school, you go to work, and there's diversity, right? There's racial diversity, economic diversity, spiritual diversity, etc. And I want my kids to see that in an environment in which God is the focus point as well. And in order to actually get there, we need to listen. We need to listen to God. We need to listen to others who are not like us. And we've actually taken as our lead verse for this, Proverbs 12:15. It says, "Fools think they need no advice, but the wise listen to others." And we want to be a church in which wisdom marks us. So we listen. We ask questions. And I don't know about you, but I learned a lot. I even learned some stuff last week. And so just all kinds of stuff that we're learning as we listen. And then Stephen Covey, he is quoted as saying, "Seek first to understand and then to be understood." And I just think one of the things we're learning as we have these conversations is if it's when you understand another perspective, it just kind of changes things a lot. And so we want to be people who listen, who understand, and who love, all right? So again, I encourage you to check out this conversation online. Now, I've said a lot there. You ready to go?
I'm fine. I'm ready.
All right. Last week, Quinest, you had a clarification. I think it's worth clarifying again, making that point again, because...
Yeah.
All right.
Well, last week I said, and I'll say it again, that I don't pretend to speak for all black people. Of course, there's a lot of diversity within our race, and it really has to do with, your age, your economic status, how you grew up, what your household looked like. So I don't pretend to speak for all black people, but I do think I'm qualified for being a black person. I think I can talk to some of these issues and hopefully provide a little insight to both whites as well as everyone else, as well as my own race. I hope to learn and learn a little bit more about how white people and other majority races feel about certain things.
Good. Well, we do want to make this as helpful as possible. So the question, or if you have questions, you can text them to the number up front. And we just got probably, Quinest, the most important question that we've fielded so far. You have no clue this is coming. It literally just got texted to me, and I'm going to just give it to you.
All right.
You don't even know it's coming.
All right.
Ready?
Yep, ready.
How does he get his bald head to look so good?
All right, so you guys want to start off like that today, huh? Well, let me tell you something. Actually, I was thinking about this week, and I was like, I wonder if they think like all black guys like bald heads or dreads or something, because it seems like it's like two predominant hairstyles. Well, let me tell you, mine is not by choice. If I could, man, I would have the biggest afro that you could ever see. I actually went bald when I was 18 years old. So I got a lot of years of practice of making it look good, I guess.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for that very serious question. Okay, well, let's just jump in. And again, if you missed last week, we laid a lot of groundwork last week. And so we're kind of building on that. If you did miss last week, it'd be helpful for you to go back and watch the video and see that. But one of the things we talked last week, Quinest, if you just wanted to give just a really quick insight into, like, when you first, as a young man, like, you were raised to distrust white people. And at this, I mean, now here you sit in a predominantly, at least for the time being, a predominantly white church, right? When did you start to feel more comfortable working with and worshiping with and being friends with white people?
I'm 38 years old now, and I think I was probably 25 or 26 before I actually started to be open enough to start feeling more comfortable around white people. And there was a couple of people who was very influential in that. This pastor of a large church in Memphis, Sam Shaw, was somebody that I had spoken to, and to be honest with you, quite suspiciously at first. But as I talked to him and as he talked to me, he really began to change my heart and let me know that not everybody thinks the same or feels the same way. And at the same time, I had a job where I was a controller for a company, and I had a general manager that we had spent a lot of time together, who was a white guy from Ohio, about the same age. And we could talk very openly about race issues, and that had been different. So I had two people come to my life around the same time when I can openly talk about these things and we can be comfortable and accept each other's realities. And I think that's probably the time when I became more comfortable around white people.
And so it was, at first, though, it was a little bit of a risk, huh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I originally started talking to that pastor, I was trying to, get zingers on him. I was trying to figure out, okay, let me prove this point, or let me prove my grandparents' point, or let me prove my racist point that everybody feels this way about us. So I was not fair and really not genuine and honest when I first started the relationship, but thankfully, as we continued to talk, things started to open up.
Do you think that attitude is prevalent among young black men today?
Yes.
A distrust of white?
Absolutely. And I hesitate because I don't like to paint everybody with the same broad brush. But yes, I think that I can honestly say probably if you took 100 young black youth, 80 of them probably feel a distrust because of what they see, because of what their parents have seen, their grandparents have seen. So yeah, I absolutely think that the black youth has probably an unhealthy distrust for others.
And I mean, in a little bit, because last week somebody said, does Quinest have questions? Like, if I were a white man in a black church, like, what would they ask me? And so he has a couple questions as well. But let me just ask you, one of the things we talked about last week was how the black community oftentimes will view a black man or a black woman who begins to work with and worship with the white community, and often they face some criticism from the black community. Somebody texted this question: how are you viewed? by other black men and women, specifically those less fortunate than you are, for both doing well and also for associating with white people?
I think the best way I can explain it is probably suspicious. They're always suspicious, and I shouldn't say they. We are always suspicious of people who operate a little bit differently. And I think it goes back to, and people have probably heard this a lot.
When you say we, is that like
Black people.
black? Because I think maybe, I mean, don't you think it's like a human thing? Maybe we're all suspicious a little bit of.
I think so. But I'll be honest with you, there's a lot of perspective about other cultures that I don't know, and we'll get into it a little bit. So I do think sometimes that we as a black culture have very unique things. Now, on the other hand, I do believe we're all the same, and we said that last time that we all have more similarities than we do differences. But I think the black race is always kind of suspicious of someone who is operating in different circles than they're used to. And it goes back to slavery. It goes back to the blacks who worked in the house versus the blacks who worked in the field. And so there was always a dichotomy between those two groups. Some believe it was intentional, from the slaving establishment, that you want to create a rift between your workers or your slaves so that you can kind of solidify and guarantee a certain way of life. And unfortunately, that same type of thinking kind of happens today. So the people who are maybe not as fortunate, who maybe have jobs that are manual labor, are going to look at the people who have jobs in the office or has reached a certain financial status as the house guy,
Right.
and themselves as the field guy. And both of those groups feel like either one of them don't truly understand what the other one is about. And of course, the house guy is always seen as someone who is trying to be friends with the people who are oppressing the people out in the field. And so I think that's the best way to describe how I may be looked at by some. Now, in the big scheme of things, I'm nowhere near the economic status of someone like a Oprah Winfrey or Michael Jordan or Bill Cosby.
You do kind of look like
that.
Michael Jordan, though.
Yeah, we talked
Okay,
about
I
that.
was just kidding.
Yeah. So I think to answer your question, that's the best way I can describe it, is they're going to look at me as suspicious because they don't know what my intentions are. Am I someone who identifies with them, that's going to try to help them and identify with their plight, or am I someone who's going to try to bring things from someone else to bring harm to them? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, as we go.
Yeah, okay. One of the things we've been talking about was, I've asked you this a few times, but what differences do you see from the days in which you were a young black man to the young black men today? Are there differences? That's 30 years, right?
Yeah.
Or 20 years, I guess,
20
sorry.
years. Yeah, 20 years. And just to give everybody a reference, I was 16, 17, 18 in the mid-'90s. And we talked about this, and I thought about this, and originally I think I told you that, there's a big difference because they're seeing more things than possibly I've seen. And what I mean by that is that they have the access to technology now is just like instantaneous. So if there's something happening in any part of the world, it takes 3 seconds to upload that video to YouTube, Vimeo, tweet. And so things are getting out. They have so much access to information. Unfortunately, the same kind of things are happening now that happened when I was a young man. Today is Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and those incidents. Well, when I was coming through, that was Rodney King. That was like right in the middle of the Rodney King incident in L.A. It was also O.J. Simpson was a big polarizing case during that time. I remember in college, man, we didn't go to class for like 2 weeks because everybody was watching that case. James Byrd, which was a guy in Texas in the late 90s that was tied to the back of a truck, a black man, and dragged to his death. So these things have been happening every decade. I think now it gets out quicker, more details come out, and they're able to, and young black youth are able to research these things. So I think it creates an environment where the temperature is like way up on this thing because of all the access of information. So is there a difference? Probably not much. But I think the big difference is they're a little bit further removed. You know, my father was in the civil rights movement, so I had a really direct line to understanding that. My grandfather was a child, was a teenager when a lot of these, riots and a lot of these things, a lot of these ethnic cleansing type activities were going on. Where the kids today are a little bit further removed from that, but they're experiencing the same thing, and they actually have more information about those things than even I had from all the records. So I think the temperature is a lot heavier today. I think in general, people are probably a little bit more, I think this is probably the most selfish time in human history, maybe, with everything is so me. Everybody's so driven for economic power. So I think there's a lot of things as a human race that makes the temperature in these grounds a little bit more fertile and a little bit more, I don't want to say evil, but hateful. So not a lot of difference in between what we've seen, not a lot of difference in between some of the things we experienced, but a big difference as far as platform and as far as environment to grow these things into even more vicious than they've ever been, probably.
So when you and I talked the first time about this, one of the things we talked about is it seems like maybe, this was my take, all right, but it seems like maybe the middle is more calm and peaceful than maybe it's ever been, and the fringes are more crazy than they've ever been. And my illustration for that was, a couple weeks ago, my girls were able to invite friends to their house, and their little friends were little black girls, which was fine. I mean, we have this great house, but I'm just thinking, like, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, that may not have been normal, but now it's normal, right? I have, my next door neighbors, there's a black family, right? And 2 doors down is another black family. So we're an integrated society, but the fringes seem like, and I think because of YouTube and, all these available, like for instance, the Eric Garner case, the I Can't Breathe. How many people saw that, right? If back in the day before all this technology, nobody would have seen it, but now it becomes like almost a marketing tool, right? I mean, and I don't know if marketing is not the right word I'm looking for, but it becomes a catalyst for, so it almost seems like the middle might be a little more peaceful and the edges might be a little more angry. Is that right?
And I can agree with that. And I think you can look at, the poorest, the gap is getting larger in that I think in the middle, it is a lot better. But the middle is also smaller now than it used to be as well. So your middle class is shrinking. There's more poor people. There's more rich people. So when you have those two different polarized scales at each end of the spectrum, it's just more vicious. It's more hateful. Temperature is really high on those things. So I agree with that. I think the middle is actually doing pretty good. I think the middle has always probably done pretty good. It's just these extreme cases that distract things and muddy up things and probably make things a little bit worse than they are.
Right. So we talked about this a little bit, but why, if you were to boil this all down, I know this is a huge question, but why would you say, give me some ideas for why you might think there is so much racial tension in America? I mean, we've got our first black president. I mean, we've got leading voices now in multiple venues. I mean, from political to academic, across the board. We've got strong black leadership in multiple venues, and yet there seems to be such racial tension. Why is that?
Well, I think that it's a fatigue amongst the black race of some of the things still happening. I mean, we went from a very, very high point of President Obama being elected. Some would say that would never happen, prior to that happening, to still seeing some of the same types of ignorant hate crimes and still seeing policy that has not been inclusive of everyone. So I think the racial tension it's there and it's getting more turned up because it's like, it's 2015, man. We're still dealing with the same stuff. I mean, you can look at every decade, and it's the same things going on. So I think it's a fatigue. I think it's just natural. If you continue to keep seeing the same things and things aren't changing, you get what? Insanity, because it's the same stuff happening, you know? And so I think people, it just stays around. I was looking at some numbers the other day. The 2013 U.S. Census says it's about 316 million people in the U.S. And of the 316 million people, it's like 45 million black people and probably 50 to 55 Hispanic or Latino people. But if you look at the incarceration rates, there's 1.3 million people between black and Hispanic. So it's 1.3 black and Hispanics out of about 100 million people in jail. And out of that 1.3, a million are black. So if you look at the numbers and you say, okay, approximately, if you look at those numbers, 200 million of white people. And out of that, there's only 1 million people in jail. So you got 200 million white people, 1 million white people in jail. You have 1 million black and Hispanic, and 1.3 million in jail. So when you look at those numbers, I'm not saying that some of those people probably deserve to be in jail. But I'm an accountant by trade. If I see numbers like that, we're going to audit something. So
Right.
if I turn my taxes in with that type of percentage discrepancy, I'm at least going to be audited. So I say that to say that when you have a group of people who experience things like that and see numbers like that, you feel kind of targeted because it just doesn't make sense. It's just looking at the numbers of the thing. So the racial tensions grow because now I have said this. Do you see these numbers? Are you telling me that something at least is not suspicious about these numbers, that we can at least look into this and address this? And when society says no, it is what it is, then you have some fatigue and people just say, okay, if it's like that, then I'm going to feel this way, I'm going to act this way, I'm going to act out this way, I'm going to be hateful because the system is hateful towards me. So I'm going to reciprocate.
Do you think that describes, like, the phrase, the angry black man? I mean, do you think this describes a lot of rage? Like, for instance, one of the things I asked this, one of my friends the other day, I had lunch with him, 17 years old,
Mm-hmm.
right? I say friend, he used to be my neighbor, and now he's 17, it was a few years ago. And we were talking about this, and I said, do all these acts of anger, like the riots, et cetera, do these come from angry young men who feel like, you're not going to listen to me anyways, so I'm going to show you how I feel? Is that an explanation, you think?
Yeah, absolutely, I think that is. I think among other things, I mean, you have incarceration rates, you have, unfair lending practices, you have, families that have been decimated. I mean, I can't imagine if my father was taken away from me. Now, the other side of that is people do things to get taken away. So I don't want to pretend like that people incarcerated, haven't done anything and that they're innocent. Some of them may have, but there probably are cases when you look at percentages like that there's a high probability that some of them probably haven't done the things or are the result of certain type of policies that have been put in place that punishes the same type of crime differently based on where you are, your economic class. So all those things come into play, and when you see evidence of that at the peers level, if I've grown up for 20 years and the first time I see my father is when I'm 20, or I don't see my father because he's, the result, and everybody deals with that, every culture deals with that, but we deal with it at a little bit higher percentage rate. So more of us probably deal with it than anybody else as a percentage. And what I mean by that is if I have 100 black families, you got 40 to 50 families experiencing that, versus if you had 100 families of another race, maybe 10 to 20 experience something like that. So you get angry because, as I said last week, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more mature. I've gotten, I think, more intelligent. So I've been able to process certain things a little bit better. But when you're young and you don't have that spiritual or that mental maturity to explain those things, the next natural emotion you're going to display is anger,
Right.
because you don't know how to deal with it. So it's a coping mechanism that hasn't been developed that gets explained through with anger.
And by the time it's developed, for a lot of young men, it's too late.
It's too late. By the time that you could probably go into the system and have conversations with young men who did heinous things that are probably now very mature, very accountable. They know what they did was wrong. They understand the impact it had on society, but it's too late. And then you have a lot of people who don't even make it, man. They're dead. So you have a little smaller subset of individuals who have been blessed enough to navigate those waters, to get to a certain age of maturity. I think another thing that kind of disappoints me, though, is that if we have a lack of mentors. You know, youth in general have just a lack of mentors to be able to teach. So someone to be able to care enough to sit down and listen to them and be able to teach them how to behave, or not even how to behave, but how to approach things logically, to think through things, to show them that there are alternatives to just being angry. There's alternatives to marching. There's alternatives to sit-ins. There's alternatives to all these things that we've been doing for 100 years now that have little impact in some cases. So it disappoints me that I think, and I'm glad we're having these conversations, because people can help with these things if they just sit down with some of these young people and explain and listen to them, understand where they are, and then teach them other methods of dealing with situations.
So a lot of people have asked this, and I mean, this question has come through a couple times even today and last week as well, but when it comes to mentoring and leadership in the black community, some of the most visible faces are, for instance, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson. And I'll just say, and I don't speak for all white people, but I do speak for some. And it feels like these guys are opportunists, and they show up and cause more trouble than saying, hey, let's sit down and come to some solutions. So from this perspective, at least, from this 39-year-old white heterosexual conservative perspective, it appears that he causes more problems than he creates. And it's not just him, but there's a subset of visual black leadership that does that. And I don't like, how do you feel towards that?
We don't need to tiptoe around this one.
All right, let's do it.
I mean, Al Sharpton is someone that a lot of black people don't like.
It's going to go viral right here.
It could. Yeah. It won't, actually, because people in our community, it's already known. 2004, he did the Democratic try to run for president. Not Mitt Romney, but John Edwards and John Kerry got more votes got more black votes than Al Sharpton. So that should tell you a little bit right then.
So who's holding? Okay, never mind.
Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, which I don't view as the same.
No, I think there may be a little difference.
Yeah, there's a little bit difference there. They're opportunists, man. I mean, look. Race to me is I look at it as almost like a product. So it's a hot product. There's just a lot of demand for racial tension and disagreements, and so they're business. Some people are businessmen, and I think personally speaking for Quinest, I personally think that Al Sharpton is a little bit of a businessman. His business is race, and so when he sees it, he's going to go out like any salesman would, and he's going to shout it to the hills that everything's about race, even before he knows all the details, even before everything has gotten a chance to come out. He's going to jump on it. I mean, it's probably the way he makes his money.
I found it interesting in the Eric Garner case in that that story in New York where this guy was purportedly choked. Apparently, he had a heart attack. But anyways, that whole thing. Mm-hmm. Al Sharpton wanted to go do the funeral, and the family wouldn't let him. Mm-hmm. Right?
There's been several. I mean, there's several cases of that, the recent events where they don't want Al Sharpton anywhere.
So
around.
Who would you point to as a mentor or a male, particularly a male model for young black men?
There's not one. I think there should be a lot. I think that's something that I've thankfully realized at a young age, that you should have a council of people that you look to, because there's positives and negatives. No man is perfect. No man is perfect. So there's gonna always be imperfections in men. So you should try to look for a multitude of them. For me, I took a lot of Martin Luther King's teachings, a lot of Malcolm X's. I like some of the things Muhammad Ali talked about. I like some of the things Jim Brown talked about. Those are entertainers and athletes, some of them, and we can have that conversation as to whether they should be considered leaders. But today, man, it's really a void, and there's a void because there's only so much media time, cameras, and exposure, and unfortunately, Al Sharpton takes a lot of it, right? So if someone has 30 minutes to watch TV, they're gonna see in our black so-called leaders have TV time. They had 10 minutes of that. 8 of it's gonna be Al Sharpton, and 2 minutes is gonna be Jay-Z. So they don't really have. It's not that we don't exist. We just don't have a lot of TV time, which leads to something else. It leads to the perpetuation of, is that by design?
Right.
So, man, when you get beat, like if you slap me 20 times, man, like everything is gonna look a certain way to me. After you slap me for 20 times and you look at me a certain way, I'm like, why are you looking at me that way? You
Right.
about to slap me again? Why are you wearing those kind of clothes today? Are those your slapping clothes? So you get to the point, and it's funny sometimes when you say, man, everything's racial. Why is the black ball behind the white ball? Why is this, that? And it's kind of like, to other races, and I understand it gets tiring. Like, come on, man, is everything about race? But when you get beat on enough, a lot of things do start to look like that.
That's such a great point, because there are times where I'm just like, come on, dude. Like, does it always have to be about? I have actually felt that. Does it always have to be about race?
Right.
You're a man, I'm a man. You're a husband, I'm a husband. You're a dad, I'm a dad. We both like Dave Ramsey. We're both working hard. There's so many things in common.
Right.
And I mean, you and I have worked through this, but there are times it's just like, good gosh, does it always have to end up there? So I mean, to hear you say that is like, okay.
Yeah, it's tiring. It got tiring to me because I was like that, man. I was that guy. I really was that guy.
Was
to
tiring
think everything about race.
It's tiring on this side of the table too, because it's like, what do I call? I mean, we talked about this last week, but what do I call him? If I call him a black man, am I offending him?
Right.
If I mean, it's just like at some point you're just like, oh God, just
right. At some point you don't want to deal with.
Just don't want to. I mean, just be friends and move on,
right?
Or not be friends and move on. But
right.
I would prefer to. I think the Lord would have us to work on reconciliation. That's why we're having this conversation.
And I think that's why race is the biggest misconception of all time, right? Because it makes us get to the point where we just don't want to deal with each other, which just falls right into the plans of the enemy.
Right, I totally agree. Now you had some questions for me, so let's do that for a little bit.
All right, man. This is my question.
Y'all doing good? All right.
Look, what's up with tanning, man? What's up with that?
That's the funniest question in the world, and I want to tell you something. I learned something. I learned that black people tan too. This is not a joke.
Really?
When I went to in a bodybuilding competition, like my first physique show, I saw black dudes back there getting spray tan. I'm like, dude, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And like they literally so black bodybuilders and black physique show competitors, they'll get a tan to even out all the splotchy spots. Like that's what we all do. So. It was funny. I didn't know that. So, you can't throw that at me anymore because
I didn't either. I didn't know that part.
Well, so I actually didn't know the answer. Like, why do people tan? I mean, I had some thoughts on it, but I thought, I wonder what Google. So I Googled it. And the funny thing is that this is actually a topic of conversation among darker skinned people, like Latinos and African Americans, et cetera, et cetera. I had no idea that people that weren't white were talking about why do white people tan? That's ridiculous. So apparently this is a topic of conversation. But I don't know. I mean, I've tanned a few times in my life, and typically they've been if I'm going to go to the beach to get a base tan, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can go to the beach and not have to slather yourself up and what's that stuff? Sunblock. And then sometimes dude, just be honest, tan looks a little bit better than pasty white. So, that's why people you run around in shorts in the summer. I don't know, and I might be quasi-metrosexual by even saying that. I don't mean to be, but I don't know why the whole tanning thing. I don't tan anymore. I just wear shorts and no shirt and mow my lawn. So, but I don't know, why do tan? It's got to be about appearance, man.
All right, I just want to know. I mean, sometimes I see people laying out the tanning bed stuff. Is like, dude, you're gonna lay in a tanning bed to get tan? Don't really know.
And now you got to pay a tax on that.
Really?
Right.
Wow.
I don't want to get political, but it is. So I'm just saying.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. That'd be interesting if you guys if anybody in here tans, you should shoot me a text. And
look, that is a big question in our community.
Are you serious?
Yeah, I'm serious. Not serious, but just kind of one of those. Man, why did he do that?
That's hilarious.
Yeah. So, I got some more questions. Can I ask some more questions?
Oh, sure, why not?
All right. Here's a little bit more of a serious one. And I think it's important to understand why certain religions, especially the Nation of Islam, why they tend to gain a little traction. Because I think a lot of black people believe that Bible-based religions have played a major role in the oppression of people, so that we constantly see images of slave masters teaching slaves from the Bible, and so stories come out of that. Like one that was predominant in my life was the whole Cain and Abel thing, and that there are some people who believe that Cain was black, and so he killing Abel and being cursed somehow paints all black people as being cursed. And I just wonder if you've heard of that story, and if that's kind of played a role at any point in your life in the way that you view black people.
That's a great question, and I actually I'm going to answer that, and I want to back up a little bit, though. A few years ago, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and he was a leader in the Islam faith in America. And his mentor was Muhammad Elijah, correct? And he's one that taught, like, white people are devils and can't be trusted, et cetera, and gave outlet to angry young black men. You and I have talked about this. And so you take a religion like Islam, and it's you have a bunch of angry young men, and here's Islam saying, destroy those who, oppress you, and it's like, yeah, that makes sense. It's an outlet for anger. Is that a fair representation?
Yes.
Okay.
And when we talked about it last week, I'm not just saying that. I do know that for any of you that weren't here last week, early on in my life, that was the religion of that some people in my family practiced. So I was exposed to that doctrine every morning.
Right.
There was certain things said and certain poems said to me as I was waking up that says, hey, you better get busy because white people are trying to destroy you. So absolutely right. And
So
I just want to let you guys know, I'm not just saying that. I've had experience with that. So that is absolutely right.
And this, and Louis Farrakhan today was actually a disciple of Malcolm X, correct?
Yes.
And maybe was there in his assassination. Anyways, that's
Yep.
a whole different thing. But, and then Christianity comes along and talks about love, 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 love. And you've got all these angry young men, and on the one hand, here's Islam saying, let's kick the tail of those who oppress us, and Christianity says, let's love those who oppress us. Which do you think is going to be more appealing to an angry young man? So I think it makes sense that Islam would be a fast-growing religion. Unfortunately, I think Christianity has been misrepresented. Because if you look at the heart of our leader Jesus, he not only loved, but he was a strong man. And he was not a wallflower. And I don't feel like we've represented Christianity well. I feel like we've made it, and pardon me for saying this, but I feel like we've made it very feminine. And we've embraced values such as compassion and gentleness and kindness rather than kick A from time to time. And I feel like if you read through the scriptures, you can't help but see strength and courage. Paul consistently calls men to be courageous and strong and to stand for what is right and to stand for justice, etc. And I believe in our desire to hold up the value of love, we've missed other things like justice and courage and strength and passion for righteousness. And it would make sense that a young man would say, well, I want to go to war rather than stay home and make bread. But I think we've missed that side of the Christian faith. And that's one of the reasons I feel like at our church we want to talk to men and say these are values that our leader Jesus has embraced. We are loving and kind and gentle, but don't come against us because we're also strong and courageous and will stand for what is true and right. So, does that answer it?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Cain, Abel.
Oh, yeah, Cain and Abel. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, so here's that story actually happened in Genesis chapter 4. And I have heard this before. In fact, I heard it this week. I was talking with somebody in my family, and they actually said that. So from my family, okay? But I guess when it would be helpful to make some clarification here. Often with this conversation about, God cursed Cain, and the curse was he made him dark-skinned, right? There's been a tendency in the white community, I think, to say, hey, slavery's been dead a long time. You're not a slave. Let's move on. We have a black president, right? Let's move on. But before getting to the Cain and Abel question, I'm actually on the wrong answer. So just forget everything I just said.
All right.
Okay,
I'm not,
here's my
but
answer.
okay.
So this story, all right, so yeah, because I actually prepared an answer. The story's found in Genesis 4. A few things about the story that I want to share with you. Nowhere in the story of Cain does it say anything about him being black or dark-skinned. Nowhere. It doesn't even mention skin color. It says God put a mark on him. There are some commentators who think maybe it was a scar, a tattoo, or something, but nowhere does it say that it was a skin color. So to impose that on the text is biblically inaccurate.
Okay.
All right, so that's number one. Number two, if you actually read the story, you'll see that the mark that God put on Cain was actually a mark of protection. So God said to him, if anybody messes with you, right, you see that mark on him, the scar, the tattoo, whatever it is, God's like, I'm putting that mark on you so that people will see him like, oh, don't mess with him. God will destroy you if you mess with him. In fact, this is actually how Genesis 4 says it. Cain said to the Lord, because Cain had killed Abel, as a result, God was going to put punishment on Cain. He kicked him out of the garden and banished him. And Cain said, my punishment is too great for me to bear. You've banished me from my land, from your presence. You've made me a wandering fugitive. All who see me will try to kill me. Genesis 4:15, the Lord replied, they will not kill you, for I will give 7 times your punishment to anyone who does. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain to warn anyone who might try to kill him. So rather than being a negative thing, it was actually God saying, I'm going to protect you. Thirdly, if you read through this passage, whatever this mark was, it was exclusively reserved for Cain. It doesn't anywhere say that this was a mark for Cain and his descendants. It was exclusively a mark in which God used to identify Cain. All right? And fourthly, speaking of his descendants, it's probably likely that they were all destroyed in the flood. One commentator says it like this. He says, unless one of Noah's sons' wives was a descendant of Cain, which is possible but unlikely, Cain's line was terminated by the flood. So I would just say that my answer to the Cain question is it's an idea that has no roots in Scripture, that's been promoted by ignorant people for unfortunate gain.
Okay. And that's kind of what I thought.
Okay.
So I'm glad to hear you say that, and I think that would help a lot of people just get a better understanding about that.
I think it just comes down to read the text.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And I mean, but unfortunately, people have read the text and saw the mark, and they just said, "Well, here's what the mark means."
Right.
They're imposing something on the Scripture that's just not there.
Right. Right.
So
The other question I had, let me find it. I just remembered it. Here's a big one. I think here's a big barrier, I think, with race relations as it relates to black people. And probably anyone who has been oppressed, not just black people, but anyone who has been. There seems like the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, seems to be understood by everyone. Like everyone understands the Jewish Holocaust and the impact it had, how horrible it was, and any kind of economic plans, or I don't like to use this word because it's been temp so high on it, but reparations, rather. Any kind of things associated with the Jewish pursuit of that is looked upon as not unfavorably. I won't say it's looked upon favorably, but it's not looked upon unfavorably. But there seems to not be that reciprocation of understanding of how slavery and how some of the, not just slavery, it's bigger than slavery. And we'll talk about some of this. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of ugly things that happen as a result of slavery, and to make sure that slavery stayed instituted. So it's not just slavery itself, but everything that it spawned. But it doesn't seem to be an understanding from everyone else how horrible that was and how many lives were lost based on that. And when I've seen the mention of economic or reparations come out of a black person's mouth, it always seems to be met with either apathy or venom. Like, I don't want to hear it, whatever. You always got your hand out. You're always looking for something. Or, come on, just turn the page. You're not a slave anymore. Just move on. So I want to know, I think that's a very important question I want to pose to you is, do you see it that way? Do you understand those two perspectives, that maybe the Jewish Holocaust is understood and a little bit supported more than the impact that slavery had on blacks?
And this is the question I was answering earlier.
Yeah.
So It's a phenomenal question. I've never really heard it. I've never made the comparison, to be honest with you. So when you asked me that originally, to compare the Holocaust to slavery, I've never done that. But as I've thought through it, I've spent some time thinking. And remember, I don't speak for all white people, okay?
Right.
But I guess it would be helpful actually for some clarification because, again, the tendency as a white man is to do what you just said. Like, dude, it was a long time ago.
Right.
We've got a black president.
Right.
That he's president because a lot of white people voted for him, right? And so the tendency would be to say, like, let's turn the page, right? But you told me a story a while ago in which that might actually help us to our church, to understand a little bit more how racial bias has actually impacted you personally and economically, and it would help us to understand this question a little bit better. You want to share that?
Well, when I say that there's things that were spawned from slavery, there was a whole, after slavery was abolished, there was a whole sharecropping movement to where, we were free from, legally, but there was still the same practices were still being instituted and even sharecropping. There was numerous incidents of blacks who were motivated, who were self-sustaining, who were accountable, who did not lean on the system to prosper, had communities all over this country. Tulsa, there was a place called they labeled it Black Wall Street in Tulsa that was destroyed in 1921 because of a claim that a black man had raped a white woman, in which they were bombed, man. That community was literally bombed. Like planes flew over and dropped bombs on it and destroyed a whole neighborhood, never to be reestablished. You have Rosewood, which a movie was made about. Rosewood, Florida, with the same type of situation, a claim of a black man committing an act against a white person that resulted in massacres and the taking of land, lynchings. So you have situations in history that large pieces of land and economic power was removed from our community, never to be reestablished. My grandfather was a plumber in San Francisco. This is the grandfather who didn't necessarily believe in God, and I said that last week, who had a very profound impact on me early on because he told me that don't trust a white man because they mean you harm. So my grandfather was an Army veteran. He fought, he served, was honorably discharged. He was from Virginia, so I'm sure he saw a lot of what I just talked about. Moved out to San Francisco, became a plumber, was very successful, amassed lots of property in a place called Half Moon Bay, California, which is right outside of San Francisco, had lots of land, who's no longer has that land for whatever reason, and I won't blame anything because I don't know the circumstances. I've heard that he sold land because of bad habits, alcohol. I've heard that some of his land was taken from him. I don't know the situation. I just know that his land was taken. But what I do know is that he was part of a community in San Francisco, a black community that had lots of business that was relocated based on government programs. So they took a whole block of black-owned businesses that was in a part of San Francisco that the local government wanted to develop for whatever reason, and relocated them to less valuable property in the less desirable part of the city. So when I say that, when we say slavery and that impact and how it impacts, it's not just the act of that slavery, it's the things that were spawned from that slavery. So when I ask that question, I think it's important for people not to necessarily agree. Because we need to get away from, do you agree with me or do you disagree with me, and we can't talk if we don't agree. But I just ask people to understand that mind state, just understand that that's how information is being processed by some people. And I think if you understand how information is getting processed, you can kind of understand their actions. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with it, but it does mean that you show some tolerance and some ability to just sit down and listen. And I think that knocks away 60%
Right.
of all the racial stuff.
Right.
So
In
I
terms
talked a lot. I hope I
No, in fact, It's great. I don't think about this stuff. So, I mean, just a quick answer in terms of reparations, I don't know what that, to be honest with you, I don't know I don't know how one would go about that.
Right.
But when I hear your story, I have a feeling in my stomach that doesn't feel very good. And that is, I mean, here, if a man works hard, one would hope that he could keep what he worked for, right? And we've worked pretty aggressively to keep this from turning political, right? So, I mean, we don't want to really go into that venue, but, I'm sorry. I hate that happened to your grandfather, and I hate the ripple effect that has,
Right. And I appreciate that, Paul, but,
You want money?
no.
Okay, I'm just kidding. Because I'm broke, dude. I mean,
No, I don't want people to feel like they have to apologize. I think that's been a barrier. It's like, okay, you want me to apologize for something that I don't really understand that,
as a man, I hate to hear that happen to another man.
Right. And I think most people feel that way. But I know that if people would understand, like you could probably tell me 50 stories that would be like, wow, I didn't understand that. And I've come to see certain things from a white perspective that makes me understand. Yeah, I can understand why that action may have been taken. I can understand. And, we get to black conservatives and stuff, and I think they've seen some of those same things.
Right.
So I just don't want people to feel like they need to apologize for anything. I think people just want you to understand where they come from. That's not a black thing. That's anybody.
That's anybody. Seek
Yeah,
first to understand,
right.
then to be understood.
Right.
Right.
People want to tell their story. They want to know that if they tell their story that you're going to listen to it, receive it, and be respectful. Not that you have to agree with it, not that you have to apologize for it or any of that thing. So I don't want that to be a barrier. I kind of feel like that's a barrier sometimes. Like people, I'm not going to, I don't want to apologize to you. I don't really fully understand where you're coming from, so how am I going to be sympathetic for you? No, it's not about that. It's just about understanding a person's perspective.
So, I mean, I didn't do it. I've never owned a slave. I've never oppressed a black man.
Mm-hmm.
But what it does is it does help me to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who has a history and to, okay.
Yep.
Well, let's do this. We have so much more to cover, and we're just not going to. And at some point, all good things must come to an end. What I want to do, though, is move to just a couple things, just some practical ways that we could actually move towards creating environments of understanding, of love, in which God would be honored. Because God is not pleased with racial tension, because He's the Father of all. And so what are some practical ways that as men and women, as a church, that we can begin to dissolve racial tensions in our homes, in our communities, in our schools, etc.?
Well, I still go back to you just got to be yourself. You just got to be genuine. You got to be able to understand where you're strong, understand where you're weak, understand where you don't understand things, and just be honest with that. If you come to me as like you've come to me and I've come to you, I don't understand it. I'm not going to pretend to understand it. Tell me about it. I think that goes a lot further than someone who tries to attack a problem with the assumption of understanding, because then you just damage situations. So there's a lot of things that the church is doing that I think is great, and I just think if you're genuine about it as you're doing those things, then great things are going to come out of it.
I think one of the things we talked about too was like racial tension actually starts. Hate is a learned emotion, right? It's a learned value, if for lack of a better word, and it starts in the home. And I would just say that I think we can do a lot for the next generation. I've had this conversation with Quinest, but with other black fathers as well, and asking, like, does the next generation get better? And I think it does. If we commit to raising our children with a new sense of understanding and listening and loving and seeking God's heart and God's ways of expression. It's okay to be a white man. It's okay to be a black man. It's okay to be an Asian man. It's okay. It's absolutely okay. But to just listen and seek to work in grace and love. And I would just say the way we talk, the jokes we make, the stereotypes that we foster in our homes go a long way towards creating racial tension, and go a long way, on the other hand, towards eliminating and dissolving racial tension and creating an environment of love. I mean, if we're cracking jokes about, black men, or in your home, the white man.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't serve us well when we come together and worship. Because when I see you, I see the black man, and I think about all those jokes that and I wonder then, are they true? Are they, and you as well. So I would just say, is particularly as Christians seeking to create an environment of love, which we're responsible for doing, watch the way, guard our tongues in the home, and seek to build one another up and encourage one another. 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 11 says. Anything else?
No, man, I think it's good. And you said something there, because I don't want this to feel like it's one-sided. It's not. There are just as many black races as there are white races. So it goes both ways. And so it applies to everyone, everything that you just said. And I hope people would understand that and be responsible in understanding that it goes both ways. I can do just as much to harm racial relations as you can.
Right. Well, I did, as we get ready to wrap up, you mentioned earlier that if you could, you would have a full afro.
Full afro.
A full afro. And I wondered what I would look like.
When I die and go to heaven, I know I'm going to have
a big afro?
Yeah.
I wondered what I would look like with a full afro.
Really?
Yeah, so this is what it would look like. What do you think?
Not much better, man.
Not much better. Get it off. Go, get it down. What do you think?
Not much better. No,
okay.
I don't think that'll work.
All right. I just want to give you guys 3 chunks of scripture, and then we're going to go. Acts 17:26 says that from one man, Adam, God created all the nations throughout the whole earth. And then in Genesis 3:20, it says that Adam named his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all living. So I talked a little bit about this last week, but if you chase our family tree back far enough, you'll find that we're all sitting at the same table, right? Because we all come from Adam and Eve. And so there really, based on that reason alone, there really is not much reason for racial tension. We can work through this stuff because we all sit at the same family table. The second thing I would say to you is that, specifically as Christians, we of all people should be the most aggressive in tearing down the wall of racial tension. And here's why I say this, because in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14, it says that Jesus came and he has broken down the wall of hostility that used to separate us. And he says by his death, he tore down the wall of animosity between the Jew and the Gentile. If you don't know, there was racial as well as religious tension between the Jews and the Gentiles. And Jesus came and he tore that wall down, and it says his purpose was to make peace between Jews and Gentiles by creating in himself one new person from 2 groups. And now together as one body, Christ reconciled both groups to God by means of his death. And our hostility towards each other was put to death. In other words, it used to be Jew and Gentile, and Jesus came and said, I want to tear down this wall, I want to bring you together so that as you focus on me, you're one person. This enables black and white and Asian, and we could just go on and on, all races, all nations to come together as one as we focus on Jesus. So if anybody ought to be aggressive in seeking to eliminate racial animosity, it should be us. Because our leader, one of the things he did was tear down the wall that separated Jews and Gentiles, etc. And finally, and we mentioned this last week, in heaven, the Apostle John had a vision of heaven in Revelation chapter 7. He said, and I saw a vast crowd there that was too great to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, and they were standing in front of the throne before God, and they were shouting with a mighty shout, salvation comes from our God on the throne. All right? And so if you're not comfortable with racial diversity here, you're not going to like heaven, because that's ultimately what it is about. Red and yellow, black and white. Remember that little song we sing, red and yellow, black and white? Right? Did you sing that song when you were a little kid? Right? They're precious in his sight. Jesus loves little children. So this is what our faith is about. And so Quinest, I want to say thank you very, very much for being willing to just sit up here and field questions. And I have a tremendous amount of respect for you, and I'm sure that our respect for you as a man has increased significantly. So I appreciate very, very much. All right?
Thanks to Church 180. I appreciate you. All right, man.
So we're going to wrap up the series next week. We're going to talk about self-hate, and then the following week will be the Super Bowl Sunday. I encourage you to be here. It's going to be fun. We're looking forward to that. Got some good things planned, and bring your friends. That'll be a great time for you to be a part of that. So let's pray, and then we'll get out of here. Father, thank you for today and for just the opportunity to have an honest conversation. I pray that it's been helpful. I pray that we've been able to understand Lord, I pray that as we have followed the heartbeat of Proverbs 12:15, where it says, the wise seek to listen, I pray, Father, that we've learned some things that will enable us, Lord, to love better, to be more aggressive, Father, in tearing down racial walls that divide us, to seek, Lord, to express your love in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our workplace, in our church. Father, we seek your heart. We want to represent you well. So we give you praise, Lord, for this opportunity and ask that it would produce much fruit. In Jesus' awesome name we pray. Amen. God bless you guys. See you next Sunday.